Robert Eggers has become one of the biggest names as both a cutting-edge horror filmmaker and a modern-day auteurist. His remake of Nosferatu was one of my most anticipated films of the year, and so I eagerly booked myself a ticket for a rare 35mm showing on a huge central London screen. Unfortunately, I ended up leaving the cinema rather disappointed, and that's not simply because I've really enjoyed Eggers' previous works, but also because I both adore the original and Herzog remake that Eggers is attempting to adapt. The original 1922 Nosferatu, A Symphony of Horror is one of the greatest and most influential horror movies of all time. Dracula? What's Dracula? That's not Count Dracula. That's Count, Orlok. So yeah, Nosferatu is a rather brazen rip-off of Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula, with just a few names changed around and some narrative difference that wouldn't really be uncommon in any other book adaptation. Count Dracula is now Count Orlok, Jonathan Harker is now Thomas Hutter, you get the idea. It's astonishing that director F.W. Murnau thought he could get away with something so blatant as plagiarizing one of the most famous works of horror ever, but amazingly, it wasn't even the director's first rip-off movie. His 1920 film, The Head of Janus, a film which, unfortunately, is presumed lost to time, was an unofficial adaptation of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Well done, Murnau. Truly, you were the asylum of your time. Now, this obvious copyright violation did indeed cause problems. The film was banned in the UK because of the fear of legal trouble, and not, as legend has it, because the film was too horrific. While in Germany, a court case against the filmmakers found in favour of Stoker's widow, and all copies of the film were ordered destroyed. Thankfully, there were far too many prints located throughout the world at this point, so it proved to be an impossible task, because otherwise this court decision would have robbed us of one of the finest films of the silent era. F.W. Murnau was one of the greatest filmmakers of the time, and incidentally, I would like to apologise for calling him the Asylum in the previous paragraph. Not only directing the original Nosferatu, but also Sunrise, A Song of Two Humans, which won the only Best Unique and Artistic Picture award at the very first Oscars, as for some reason they originally decided to divide the Best Picture category into two different awards. Nosferatu was also at the forefront of the German Expressionism movement, along with films such as the equally excellent and pioneering The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and later examples such as Fritz Lang's Metropolis. Expressionism externalized the character's inner emotions. In The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, sets and shadows would distort in order to emphasize feelings of madness. It was a rebellion against realism, and along with Soviet montage, which was coming out of the USSR, produced some of the most arresting and powerful films of the silent era. In preparation for Eggers' remake, I went back and watched the original 1922 film, and even after over a century, it holds up like few films from before the talkies could even dream of. So, to understand why 2024's Nosferatu ends up falling so short, I think it's important that we look back on both the original and also the excellent 1979 remake to see what made them so great. Part 1. Nosferatu, A Symphony of Horror. The first thing that strikes you when watching Symphony of Horror is how riveting and timeless both its cinematography and editing are. It's gorgeous and gothic, sucking you into this netherworld of darkness and decay, while also feeling in its first half like a bleak and ultimately doomed adventure. The use of tinting to denote night and day further steeps the movie in atmosphere. It's a commonplace technique throughout silent cinema, but Nosferatu draws close attention to it. I hesitate to bring up Dario Argento's Suspiria, but that film's rich visual style certainly owes a debt to Nosferatu and German Expressionism as a whole. The editing too has not aged a bit. Many silent films oftentimes held on long wide shots for extended periods. Remember, film as an art form wasn't even 25 years old at this point, and many of the traditions of theatre were still being utilised in place of a defined cinematic language. Murnau, of course, was not the first to see the potential of cinema as unique to theatre. Méliès's A Trip to the Moon was already 2 decades old by this point. But it is striking when watching Nosferatu how effortless and instinctive the editing is. It doesn't put a foot wrong and keeps you glued to the screen even a century on. This really isn't a given when watching early cinema, and the film's storytelling still holds up in a similar manner. It's briskly paced, divided into 5 acts, yet very much fitting into a traditional 3-act structure, and there's constant tension building as not Count Dracula journeys to terrorize the city of Weisberg. This is aided by the use of intertitles, which recall to mind a structure of the book that it definitely isn't an adaptation of. Seeing the story from the point of view of journals, and an overarching first-person narration allows us to see into the minds of the characters while viewing their actions from an objective lens, and the excellent typography is iconic too. The film's expressionistic touches have aged beautifully as well. The dramatic shadows and eerie sets, while not quite as stylized as they are in Dr. Caligari or Metropolis, amplify the movie's gothic atmosphere. Producer and production designer Albin Grau's costumes and sets encompass this heightened reality to a T, and he's also responsible for the detail in the film's use of the occult, as Grau was a member of the Fraternitas Saturni, or Brotherhood of Saturn, a society that took all this dark mysticism stuff deadly seriously. Nosferatu's filmmaking is still a marvel to behold, but it is Max Schreck's singular performance as Count Orlok that has cemented the movie in horror legend. It's one of those performances that it almost feels weird mentioning the actor by name, because you don't see an actor playing a character, it's just the character. Schreck's monstrous performance is otherworldly, placing Orlok perfectly within the uncanny. The vampire's radiant physicality is instantly resonant, especially given the fact that he doesn't have the luxury of audible dialogue to work with. Everything about the character, from the macabre makeup to his walk and facial expression, to that instantly recognizable way he rises from his coffin, which is thanks to some great makeup and early practical effects, is iconic. All the other performances in the film, Gustav von Wagenheim as Hutter and Greta Schroeder as Ellen, are fine. They're very typical hyper-expressive performances one would expect from German Expressionism, but Schreck gives what is truly one of the great performances of early cinema. Finally, Hans Erdmann's original score for the film, which I highly recommend watching the movie with, is largely outstanding. Heightened and darkly melodramatic, it is a key part of the winding tension of the film. And though at times it can be a little too bombastic, most notably in the Ship of Death sequence where a more minimal passage would have been more effective, it is still an inexorable part of the film's overall package. Over 100 years from the movie's release, it would be a stretch to say that the film is still as scary as it once was, but it certainly remains bleak and otherworldly. The tinted cinematography and Schreck's performance combine to make a masterful horror classic, immersing us in this gothically grim parallel universe rather than providing us with traditional scares. And the film's final act, portraying the city burning as a result of plague, now hits audiences post-pandemic with a similar level of bleakness that it must have done for people back then in the aftermath of the Spanish flu. There are precious few silent films not directed by Charlie Chaplin or Buster Keaton that are to this day embedded in popular culture. Nosferatu not only being among those, but arguably leading the pack, is a monumental achievement that one really cannot overstate. With the exception of Chaplin's Tramp, what other character from this era is so instantly recognizable? Nosferatu! Part 2. Nosferatu, the Vampire. So with a classic film of such prestige, it would truly take someone who is either a genius or insane to attempt to remake the film not simply as another Dracula adaptation, but to do so explicitly as another version of Nosferatu. Unfortunately, we got both, because I give you Werner Herzog.
So this literally just happened when we were standing outside there. Camera. And there was a noise and it was a whiz, and you just said, "I've been shot." You had, look, you're bleeding.
I think here somewhere. Yeah.
Look, I mean, somebody shot at you and created a wound in your abdomen.
It's not significant.
Yes, legendary German filmmaker Werner Herzog did a remake of Nosferatu in 1979, and it is outstanding. Herzog has a great and wide-ranging filmography, spanning both narrative and documentary. He's also a man who does not do things by half measures. For Fitzcarraldo, he pulled a very real paddle steamer over a mountain. In his documentary, La Souffrée, he and his crew went to the evacuated island of Guadeloupe, which was thought to be facing imminent volcanic destruction, to interview the one dude who decided to stick around for it. He's a singular character in cinema history, and virtually everything he does is certainly worth watching. For his Nosferatu remake, Herzog wanted to bridge the gap between classic German Expressionism and contemporary German cinema, which is sometimes referred to as German New Wave. He described the original film as the most important German film of all time, and now, seeing as the copyright had lapsed on the original novel, Herzog could remake it license-free while being able to revert many of the characters' names back to those from the original book. Now, it would take a madman director to even attempt a remake of such ambition, but who's going to be crazy enough to step into Max Schreck's shoes? To invite such comparisons with your acting would take an act of immense bravery or just downright insanity, and ladies and gentlemen, I give you Klaus Kinski.
Schrei ich oder schrei ich nicht? Und du sagst es mir nicht, aber ich schrei aber nicht. Leg mich doch am Arsch weg. Der Moment ist überhaupt gekommen, wo ich dir in die Fresse haue. Was? Diesmal schlag ich ihn, die Verslaufrate dich verlassen, du!
Despite Kinski's propensity for on-set meltdowns, Herzog and him have been frequent collaborators, and he is a fantastic follow-up for Shrek. Kinski captures the unearthly undertones of Shrek's original performance, while not simply imitating it. His inhumanity is clearly utilising the pastiche of the nobility that's very much innate in the story of Dracula. His manner of walking and speech is uncomfortable and alien, but recognisably so. Now, Shrek will always be my Orlok. In fact, my Dracula in general. Though, I must admit, I've not yet seen Christopher Lee's turn in the role. But as far as I'm concerned, Kinski hits a home run here. This is how you simultaneously pay homage to a classic, while doing something that's uniquely your own. And the performance marks yet another outstanding collaboration between the esteemed actor and director. Going toe-to-toe with Kinski, however, is one of my favourite actors of all time, and debatably the greatest scream queen ever put to film. The incredible Isabelle Adjani. Adjani is probably most well known for her award-winning performance in Andrzej Żuławski's horror masterpiece Possession, a film which I have covered both on this channel, in my original underrated horror videos, and back in the first season of my podcast, the Extreme Cinema Podcast. But suffice it to say, I fucking love this movie. Boy, I've mentioned both Suspiria and Possession in the same video. I'm really getting through the Sternberg bingo card today, aren't I? Anyway, Adjani is of course radiant in the role of Lucy, who was called Ellen in the previous film. In the 1922 version, she's just sort of there, and doesn't really have much to do. In Herzog's version, however, she's functionally the lead in the second half of the movie. She's a captivating presence, matching the vampire's spooky gothic vibes, while bringing a lot of empathy to the role too. She's so expressive, it's definitely a heightened performance, and both her and Kinski understand the assignment to a T. What Herzog is doing in this remake is taking something similar to the imagery and atmosphere of the original film, and emphasize it by holding on it for longer. There's a far more contemplative tone and slower pace than the 1922 film here, and cinematographer Jörg Schmidt-Reitveen, another frequent Herzog collaborator, does an outstanding job interpolating the gothic imagery and focus on nature of the first film in a way that very much extends its power. This drawn-out atmosphere gives way to the surreal in the film's latter act, and this is where the movie is at its strongest. The portrayal of this plague-ravaged town is terrifying even to this day, and Herzog immerses us into the experience of a city full of people, at first mortally afraid, growing into their utter acceptance of their painful deaths. The movie's costumes and sets are inextricably linked with this atmosphere. There really is just something about the time period from an aesthetic point of view that amplifies the hyper-reality of the film's imagery. The sets too are also gorgeous. Whether it be Dracula's derelict castle or the German splendor of Weisberg that is turned so rapidly on its head, one of the greatest strengths of Herzog's film is its hypnotic power in drawing you into the world. A world that is both typical classic gothic horror, while doing this reimagining of the legendary horror classic with such confidence and vision. I think a really interesting comparison to illustrate exactly what direction Herzog took from the original film is to compare it to Francis Ford Coppola's adaptation of the Bram Stoker novel. Herzog clearly wanted to emphasize the atmosphere and feeling of the original, while Coppola is more interested in the story and universe. It takes Herzog 2/3 of his runtime to get to where Coppola gets in half that time. That's not to say that Coppola's film is devoid of atmosphere, or that slower pacing by default equals evocative filmmaking, but Coppola discusses the lore of Dracula, going into his backstory and what vampires actually are, whereas none of this is of any concern to Herzog, and thus it just doesn't appear in the film. This is a really good indication of two distinct and celebrated artists having different focus and seeing different things within the same story. Herzog's Nosferatu, if made by a different filmmaker, could easily have gone in the direction Coppola took. And that interpretation of the source material is a large factor in what makes the retelling of a classic story like this either work or not. Well, that and also whether or not you mistakenly decide to cast Keanu Reeves.
If I may inquire, what in fact happened to Mr. Renfield in Transylvania?
I've seen many strange things already. Bloody wolves chasing me through some blue inferno.
I know where the bastard sleeps. I brought him there. To Carfax Abbey.
Part 3, Nosferatu 2024. On paper, Eggers should be the perfect man to retell this story in its form as Nosferatu. Eggers' first two features, The Witch and what I consider to be his masterpiece, The Lighthouse, are outstanding period horrors with a real focus on character and an eye for psychological detail. They're both beautiful films, while also being horrifying in a way that's both intensely modern, while conversely rooting themselves within a lot of classic horror, with the former being set in 17th century Massachusetts and the latter being an Edgar Allan Poe adaptation. Even Eggers' Viking epic The Northman, a film that's budget meant Eggers regrettably had to relinquish Final Cut, for all its flaws, is a thrilling and engaging piece of filmmaking, balancing its archetypal revenge narrative within a world of esoterica and extreme violence. After what, for many, though I must confess not me, was a letdown with The Northman, it felt right that Eggers would return to an artistic period horror film, and hearing that he would be taking on the Nosferatu story made me very excited. Here was his chance to mix the costume drama and characters that he is so good at creating, while using his incredible visual eye to pay homage to German expressionism. Unfortunately though, the finished product does not in fact live up to this. It's a huge mess that does as much very wrong as it does right, and it is easily Eggers' weakest film to date. I do genuinely feel a little bad saying this, because even with its many flaws, Eggers and his longtime DP, Jarin Blanch's cinematography is amazing, and at times even masterful. Every aspect of composition has been perfectly honed. These are master craftsmen at the height of their prowess, and there are many shots in this that feel like moving paintings made by an all-time great artist. The lighting, motion, shadow, where everything is positioned on frame, it's stunning. And the film utilizes all of these facets of cinematography to evoke similar gothic imagery to its predecessors. Eggers also uses this as an opportunity to make some noteworthy callbacks to expressionism, with one shot of Orlok's shadow enveloping the city being a standout moment that many people have noted. The costumes and sets are similarly impressive, especially combined with the snowy weather throughout much of the film. The outfits are grand, worthy of any big-scale costume drama, and there's something rather riveting about the bourgeois living we're seeing being interrupted by the sudden unexpected horror that befalls the town. I wish we got to see more of the surroundings. There's a great long take around the city as it's collapsing, and it's genuinely gorgeous scenery, and so too is the magnificently realised set of the inn where Hutter, I guess we're back to Hutter in this one, stops before his journey to the castle. The castle, in fact, being the only generic moment setting-wise. Robin Carolan's score also plays its hand in drawing you into the film, but unfortunately it's as inconsistent as the movie as a whole. Sometimes enriching the world with an eerie atmosphere, while unfortunately at other times amounting to not much more than a spooky string section, which in fairness matches the variety of the horror sequences. As I mentioned before, there's some great imagery in this film, and as always the ship of death scene steals the show, but also it's got its fair share of cliches and generic jump scares. I mean, how many times before have we seen a possessed woman with her back arched speaking in a deep voice? I think it would be incumbent on filmmakers to avoid repeating the same scene over and over again in every possession movie ever. I'm sorry to tell you all, but The Exorcist perfected it 50 years back. The script in general, while stylish, is ultimately substanceless. From my cursory knowledge of literature from the time, by which I mean the Sherlock Holmes stories, the period accuracy certainly rings true, and you get your fair share of grandiose dialogue here. This splendor, however, is in service of absolutely nothing, as the script does little more than push the story forward. The film's themes aren't explored, there's little to provoke thought, and while some of the characters are engaging, they are little more than two-dimensional beings in service of the plot, which, I remind you, we have seen countless times before. Looking back on the film now, I can think of only one character who had an actual arc, which is Aaron Taylor-Johnson's role, and his performance isn't even particularly noteworthy. In general, the performances in this film range wildly in terms of quality. Fortunately, lead actor Lily Rose Depp was fairly fantastic as Ellen. She's no Isabelle Adjani, and it is unfortunate that at times they were clearly trying to replicate her performance, but she understands the assignment exactly. Her wispy gothic charm and empathy are palpable, and along with the cinematography, she is one of the reasons this film remains watchable. So too are both Willem Dafoe and Ralph Ineson's performances engaging. Willem is our stand-in for Van Helsing, and there can be few, more obvious casting choices for Eggers to make here. He's Willem Dafoe. He's charismatic and humorous, and also his big pipe was a brilliant touch. The second best screen-smoking presence of the year, just behind Sergio Castellito's vaping reactionary cardinal in Conclave. Nicholas Hoult, however, is a serviceable co-lead. I think he's a fantastic actor, and he really transformed himself recently in Justin Kurzel's underrated thriller The Order, where it took me half the film to realise it was him. In this, however, it's just Nicholas Hoult in a top hat. and that's very much down to him just not having a lot to work with. They also attempt to make the character slightly less stupid than in previous adaptations, which consequently has the opposite of its intended effect. As now he's questioning all this crazy stuff going on around him, it makes it less believable that he doesn't just up it and run. Counterintuitively, the character is actually more believable when he's a complete idiot and is just like, this is fine, when he wakes up with bite marks. But now we come to Bill Skarsgård's portrayal of Orlok, and this is perhaps the film's most major misstep. Skarsgård is dreadful in the role. It's not even the makeup's fault. I actually don't mind that they make him look slightly more human. However, because they keep it hidden in the shadows for so long, its reveal ended up being rather underwhelming. It's his acting in general. It completely lacks the physicality of Shrek and Kinski's performances. Those two moved in a manner that was almost inhuman, perfectly walking that line in the uncanny valley. Skarsgård, however, just seems like some old dude with a weird voice. A weird voice that sounds like the guy from Louis Theroux's Weird Weekends that claimed he could channel aliens.
Within the next 4 to 6 of your Earth months, there will be a dramatic change in your life activity.
I legit spent the whole movie expecting him to relay a message from the Honorable Corton. I didn't believe this was Orlok every time he opened his mouth. He wasn't intimidating or creepy or uncanny or otherworldly, he was just a silly little man. And you know what, even if the rest of the film was better, his performance still may have ruined the movie. This film was such a disappointment. As I said, on paper, Eggers and Nosferatu are a match made in gothic heaven, but his remake fails to even approach either of the previous films. Though its cinematography and some of the performances are indeed noteworthy, it ultimately stands as a failure. The world of both Murnau and Herzog's film exists on a plane between our own and the netherworld, while Eggers' film lacks the power or intrigue of both these works, and has left me primarily with an overwhelming sense of frustration for what could have been. So, did you like the new Nosferatu? As always, let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please consider tipping me on Ko-Fi. The link is in the description, and also in the description is the link to my podcast, the Extreme Cinema Podcast. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you all next time.